Let's talk about hair.
What's your definition of good hair?
Something that looks relaxed and nice.
If your hair is relaxed, white people are relaxed. Your hair is nappy, they're not happy.
This brother here, myself, all of us were born with our hair like this, and we just wear it like this.
Hair is important because for me, it's like our crown.
Hair is ASU English professor Neal Lester's domain. He has studied it, written about it, and he recently sat down with me in our studios to talk more about why hair means a lot more than we might think.
We rarely have hair in its quote-unquote natural form without combing or parting or teasing or spraying or dyeing or straightening. So in many ways, hair becomes a social construct. It becomes a way in which we costume ourselves and our identities.
His research focuses mainly on African Americans and hair, but he argues you could fill that blank in with just about any other group.
For example, American Indians have certain traditions that are associated with not cutting hair. Mm-hmm. There are Bible stories that have to do with cutting hair and covering hair in terms of gender. This notion of hair is something that I've looked at because it's been so mainstream, not just in terms of people's personal preferences, but the ways in which hair is politicized and their policies around hair, from public schools to military. So there are ways in which hair has always been bigger than we've imagined it when we say things like, oh, I'm having a bad hair day.
Yeah, and there's a lot that goes into that. So let's break that down a little bit.
Sure.
So what do we mean in general when we say somebody has great hair? Somebody has bad hair, right?
Right. Well, it depends on who's actually saying that. There's a piece that I use in my presentations from the early 90s with Jennifer Aniston, and she's on the cover of, I want to say, Yes magazine. And the title for this picture of her, which is an image of Jennifer Aniston from Friends, saying Hair of the Year. So I then reflected that, in the 80s and late 70s, I want to say, Farrah Fawcett had the hair that everyone wanted.
Right.
Well, that was every white woman wanted because that was not a preference for brown and black women.
Right.
And what I started seeing was the extent to which those hairstyles became bigger than just the hairstyle, that the hair represented femininity, the hair represented beauty, the hair represented desirability. Mm-hmm. And so when people can say things like, oh, this is hair of the year, then someone has constructed an ideal. And that ideal has not always been accessible to everybody. There are all these nuances and ways that it sort of connects. So yes, my research is primarily on African Americans. And I started this conversation doing it just by looking intellectually at literature without sort of looking at the ways in which my own life personally had sort of intersected around hair ideals and hair identities, and my mom who wore wigs, and my grandmother who would never go out of the house if her hair wasn't done. So even the rhetoric of hair became fascinating to me.
Yeah. Let's talk about your own hair story, right? As you say, everyone has a hair story.
Everybody has a hair story, and I would add to that, and that hair story connects you to someone else.
Right. So you have, dreadlocks, is that what you would call them?
Now.
All
yes.
the way past your shoulders, right?
Now. Because I haven't always had dreadlocks.
Right.
And, some people even have an issue calling them dreadlocks rather than locks.
That's
so
why I asked
there's
you.
a lot about how do you name it. I started this just before coming to Arizona State University 23 years ago, and part of it was that something was happening in my life personally that I felt that I didn't have any control over. And I had sort of been as a young professional and a new assistant professor with a flat top fade, which was very military-like, and it was very establishment, and that was fine. But in this new phase of my identity and my spirituality, I felt like I needed to do something that felt like I was reclaiming what I felt was being taken away. And hair became my way of sort of manifesting that. And it was very interesting because immediately I got responses from other people saying, oh my God, that's never going to happen if you're going for job interviews. And I thought, well, this will be part of my job interview. And lo and behold, coming to ASU, the interviewing team were curious about my hair.
Asked you. Wow.
They asked me about the hair, which intersects with my research.
Yeah.
So the idea of hair became less an intellectual exercise. How does Shange write about it? How does Maya Angelou write about it? How does Toni Morrison write about it? It was my own personal way of showing that hair becomes one of those things that shows that the personal is political and the political is often professional. So we may think that this is just about a hairstyle, but this is more than a hairstyle. And over the years, I've watched different people respond to my hair. So people would say things like, oh, you must be a musician. Or in Hawaii, I tell this story fondly, is I was getting off the plane, and as soon as I got off the plane, there was somebody who was sort of putting his fingers together and sort of putting the fingers to the lips.
Right.
And we're on radio, so I can't quite show you, but it's not quite smoking a cigarette, but it's smoking something else.
Right.
And the implication was that because I have locks, then I must know where to get pot and weed. I've been everything except a professor.
You mentioned stereotypes, right? Which I
Yes.
know is not a word you love to use. But are there moments when this can go the other way, when it can be empowering, when it's been reclaimed?
Absolutely. I think the sort of natural hair movement, and I keep using air quotes for radio, the natural hair movement has been a way of reclaiming in the same way that I was trying to reclaim an identity that I thought I had lost based on a certain circumstance that I had no control over. Mm-hmm. So there has been a way. We see little children now with locks. We see lots of cornrows, but at the same time, we see policies against that, where little kids have not been able to take their school pictures because their hair was in braids or cornrows. Or we saw the instance where the wrestler had his locks cut just before a match on the mat.
Yeah.
It was devastating. And even though he won the match, you could see just how defeated he was because his hair had been cut. So on the one level, there's a reclamation because we see more people who look like me in the public sphere. That does not necessarily mean that policies have changed in the same ways that people's personal choices have changed. Yeah. And I think the big message for me is that hair is often more than just a style.
I want to ask one question about gender here, too,
Yes.
because that is becoming more fluid in this generation.
Yes.
Sexuality plays into this, and that's becoming more fluid.
Yes.
How are you seeing this play out in hair in that realm?
Well, it's interesting because, and I'm certainly not an expert in this area. This is just based on some armchair observations. But as I learn more about transgender identities, I see that hair is actually often part of that. So as I have students, for example, who inform me at the beginning of a class that my pronoun is actually this, my name is this, although on the roster it may say this, that one of the ways that one can sort of transition into that is through hair. Yeah. And it can be multiple ways. Sometimes it's about growing facial hair. Sometimes it's cutting long hair and making it look more like a certain category. It's interesting because on the one hand, we want to make these things very fluid, but in cases where we're talking about transgender realities, it's often moving toward binaries. And that the binary that cisgender people are trying to break out are actually binaries that some transgender people are embracing so that their lives are not as difficult. It's really complicated, but so exciting.
Dr. Neal Lester, thank you so much for coming in.
Oh, thank you for the exciting conversation.